Fentanyl. What does it have to do with the Canada-US border issue that's going on right now? Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. If you listen to members of the Trump administration, well, this is all about fentanyl. And in fact, they've called it a drug war, not a trade war. Here's Ken Hassett.
It's totally 100% being miscovered, this story. What you need to do is go back and read the executive order where President Trump was absolutely 100% clear that this is not a trade war, this is a drug war.
Howard Lutnick, Trump's Commerce Secretary, had a similar comment last week.
The president is focused on ending fentanyl coming into the country. You know that the labs in Canada are run by Mexican cartels.
But if you listen to Canadian officials, well, they will tell you that fentanyl is not an issue, that less than 1% of the fentanyl intercepted crossing the Canada-US or crossing into the US across a land border came from Canada, just 43 pounds last year. Well, sad fact is 43 pounds is enough fentanyl to do a lot of damage, but it still does pale in comparison to Mexico. So what is the issue going on here? Are we missing something? Is Trump crazy? Is Trump lying? Sam Cooper is an investigative journalist. He is the founder of the Bureau, and he knows a lot more about this than I do. So Sam, thanks for taking some time to join me today and go over this. My simplistic view of it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or right, is that there's probably more fentanyl going across than we realize, but more importantly, we're the bankers for the drug cartels and the triads. Would that be accurate?
That's completely accurate. I mean, in two parts. One, yes, this is all about a financial facilitation model. The U.S. intelligence and law enforcement community knows that Chinese organized crime are the underground bankers that essentially fund the logistics for Mexican cartels to run fentanyl across North America. And Canadian cities, most specifically Vancouver, as my research has shown for years, and Toronto, are used at scale to launder money really around the world through what is now called the Vancouver model of money laundering. And that is just essentially how precursors are coming into Mexico and Vancouver's port from Chinese factories. The pills are being pressed up, importantly in British Columbia. The proceeds are laundered. They're moved back through underground banking accounts to China. And then more fentanyl precursors are coming into North America. But I would add that, people need to understand that Vancouver, British Columbia was cited in President Trump's, statement justifying the tariffs for a reason. And as my research has shown, the Port of Vancouver has been infiltrated by what are called these Chinese transnational triads. That means shipping entities, docking facilities are being run by sophisticated organized crime. And the data points that I look at, even people can look at CBSA figures and find hundreds of kilograms of fentanyl precursors have been that has been captured, is documented at the Vancouver port. That is what is, powering these super labs that are now turning up in BC and Alberta. So 40 pounds, if it's caught at the land border, it's nothing in comparison to what is being produced in British Columbia. And as you say, the whole money laundering system using our real estate and banks, that's what the U.S. government is deeply concerned with.
Cut off their money, you cut off their power. So thus the joint task force that became part of the package for what Justin Trudeau agreed to get the 30-day pause on tariffs. Let's talk about fentanyl coming from Canada and going into the US, though, because Trump's executive order mentioned the mail. And that was the first time I'd heard the Americans talking about that, coming through international mail. Well, Canada-US is international mail. When we started hearing about fentanyl coming in from China, at first it wasn't the Port of Vancouver, it was our mail system. People would just pop it in the mail, send it across. We talked about that in our own parliament. We had people warning us, you've got to do something. So if it happened to us, why wouldn't it happen the other way? Is there a lot of that fentanyl going through mail shipments, or is it, as you say, comes into the port of Vancouver, gets pressed into pills, then goes back out through the port and maybe smuggled into the US in another way.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about what I know and what I have an educated guess on. So what I know is that the western coast of Mexico and the western coast of Canada have become the key both importation hubs for those fentanyl precursors. So we're talking about industrial scale precursors coming into the west coast of Canada. And that is the first indication of major problems. We're also talking about numerous drug labs, fentanyl pill presses that have been sent in from China and run by cartels and organized crime in British Columbia to press up those pills. So then it could go, out in the mail. I would assume that that is one of the channels that it's going down into the United States. I'm aware of, U.S. justice cases that point to a convicted criminal. I believe it was in a Quebec jail, was one of the important figures involved in those mail fentanyl rings. Sorry, mailing of fentanyl into the United States. That tells you
From a
something.
prison.
Yes, a prisoner in a Quebec jail was one of those ones and indicted in one of these major cases in the United States. So there's another clue for the unfortunately clueless Canadians about how central we are to this compromise. Another big point is the U.S. Attorney General came out with, I believe it was 6 sanctions and the U.S. Treasury about a year ago, 5 Chinese companies and 1 British Columbia company. Again, there wasn't even a Mexican company involved in that activity. So what I know is that Canada is now admittedly an exporter nation. Vancouver's port is compromised at a massive scale, and not just Vancouver's port, Montreal, Halifax. We've got a problem with organized crime running our ports. And, again, if it's getting through our mail system into the United States, it could be, a big problem. But I look at what I know, and that is it's being produced on a massive scale in Canada, and it's about the precursors being shipped in at an industrial scale.
I mean, this should not be a shock for people who follow organized crime, know the history. We've long been a point for Americans to smuggle drugs through using organized crime. You go back to the French Connection, that great movie. There was a Canadian component there. You look at a great book by my colleague Adrian Humphreys about the Sixth Family. The Rosado
Yes.
family became massive.
Yep.
Then there was the family in Toronto that fell apart. I think they ended up down in Venezuela. They were cocaine and heroin kingpins, operating out of suburban Toronto,
Yep.
and supplying the United States. When you've got all of that happening in the past, why wouldn't it happen now? Now it's with Mexican cartels and Chinese triads. So why are our politicians reluctant to admit this?
Brian, I did another podcast today and I was shown footage of myself being questioned in Canada's Parliament in 2023 about our Chinese election interference and attacks on politicians. And all I remember was being attacked by Liberal Party members and NDP members sitting on their hands, not even asking a question. And I was reminded of the denialism around China's interference in our elections. To me, that's bringing back exactly what we're hearing, from a lot of people in Ottawa right now are saying only 40 pounds of fentanyl at the border. How can we be lumped in with Mexico? But those people, they haven't had my experience of being a reporter in Vancouver and seeing absolute third to fourth world death conditions on our streets. And Brian, as you've reported, we see it in Toronto now as well.
Oh, and
Uh, it's
I've
growing.
walked through the Lower East Side, and it's only gotten worse since I was last there.
It's getting worse and worse, and I do think we've got pretty much an elite, whether a political or business, maybe even legal, academic elite, mostly in Eastern Canada, that's playing that doesn't know or doesn't care to know that Canada is being used by the worst international organized crime. And as I say, and the US government now says, Beijing is behind this fentanyl trade. And I just don't understand how people are denying that Canada is essentially being used by China in this way.
Uh, Explain something that you mentioned earlier. You talked about the Vancouver model. Um, you know, I've read about it. It makes sense to me why they would do this. Um, but I don't think a lot of people know that this exists. This is, if there were a business, an MBA for organized crime, this would be one of the modules that they would teach, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in a simple way to explain it, and people don't need to take it to, they can read in less colorful language from FinTrack. Look, China has capital export controls. The communist system on every citizen could only export $50,000 per year. But as we know, China has tremendous wealth and also massive corruption. So their people, people of great wealth can get the funds anywhere they want in the world by essentially making a deal with an organized crime underground bank in whatever city they want to go to. But Vancouver, having a massive diaspora population from Hong Kong and China, has massive underground banks. And so, look, to break it down, let's say you're a tycoon from Shenzhen. You put $1 million down in a bank that can only be described as owned by a drug trafficking organization in Wuhan who happens to sell fentanyl precursors. So you put your $1 million down, you travel to Vancouver, you get, a few transactions of duffel bags of cash, walk into the casino, and that's your payout of essentially $1 million with a little bit of a fee. And the BC casino, because the rules are so lax and people were in on it in the government, they let you gamble that drug cash. And so, the money is laundered, and it eventually, through various ways, goes back to China, sends more fentanyl in. I'll make it a little more clear. What was really innovative about the Vancouver model is this underground banking became so prevalent that people in China didn't even have to put money down. They could make a deal with the gangsters in Vancouver, say, I'm going to meet you outside the casino. You give me that, a duffel bag of cash. I gamble and I'm going to pay you back in China. So, that just shows you how the money, the drug cash was gambled in a casino and the borrower pays back in China. So it's creating that dirty money Vancouver loop.
It's absolutely incredible. And you say that is transferred to Toronto and some of the casinos in and around the GTA as well. Are these all legal casinos or are they some of the underground? Because we have seen some underground casinos busted too.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in Toronto remember the shock during the COVID pandemic of a 50-room mansion in Markham that was essentially operating, as the York Regional Police say, a commercial level casino in a mansion with prostitution going on. As I've reported and others have not, with Canadian politicians there, this is one of those casinos that during the pandemic took up the let's just call it the scale of gambling because government casinos were locked down. And so this is exactly the same model. Again, as others, I reported, a few others picked up on it. When my reporting shone a light on this activity of the Vancouver model, the organized crime gangs that run this essentially North American Western Hemisphere money laundering moved a lot of their flow to Toronto. So the Vancouver model became the Toronto model. And Brian, as I've reported, the DEA, that's America's intelligence and drug counter interdiction agency, believes that Chinese triads in Toronto are running North American money laundering for the cartels. And of course, our banks are involved, our real estate, and those underground casinos just make it very apparent.
And we just had a major Canadian bank pay a fine in the United States over not allowing money laundering to happen.
There's your, when you talk about denial, you talk about the US government picking up and doing our work for us, having to drag us kicking and screaming to enforce our own laws. There's your evidence.
Yeah. It'll be fascinating to see if anything changes over the next little while. Sam, always a pleasure. And a pleasure reading you as well. Enjoy your work, keep it up, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks.